Nostalgia. It's one hell of a drug. Nostalgia is what best identifies this remaster, as it's a game that updates and attempts to modernize a PSP game from the late 2000s. The original Crisis Core was a very straightforward experience. You play as Zack Fair, a relatively minor character from the original Final Fantasy VII, and follow his journey as a soldier working for Shinra. Following from this character's perspective, the player is guided through two separate parts, 10 chapters, 5 chapters each, which leads to Zack's ultimate demise and sets up the events of the original game. Sounds intriguing, right? Well, it would be intriguing, perhaps, if the year was still 2007 and you're under the age of 18. The fact of the matter is that regardless of Crisis Core Reunion's many updates, and there are many according to this list on IGN's wiki for the game, Crisis Core Reunion, quite simply, is a terrible game. One that tries to entice the player only with nostalgia while failing in virtually every other category, be it storytelling, combat gameplay, or content offerings. It's a rather simple reminder of Square Enix's streak of mediocrity for over the past 2 decades. A record that seems to permit, despite having punked the mainstream gaming audience to believe otherwise through means of disguising their below-average games with eye-candy graphics and real-time combat systems that rip off other popular mainstream franchises. Despite the many faults this remaster has, I must admit that it was rather comical to see Square Enix try to pull the smooth animations from the Final Fantasy VII Remake and insert them in this game. It's too bad that this gameplay connection between the two titles stops here, and this game instead sticks to outdated mechanics and systems from the original that are severely outdated by modern standards. The first core issue with Crisis Core Reunion is the story. This story introduces nothing of value and brings nothing of relevance to the lore of the original Final Fantasy VII, ultimately doing the series no good. The new characters, Angeal and especially Genesis, are grating to listen to, and they undeniably act as a diatribe for awful, cringeworthy dialogue and non-existent character agency. Angeal could be seen as a forgiving new element introduced in the story since he directly interacts with Zack as a mentor-mentee relationship, which I personally disagree with. But then you still have Genesis, who has to be one of the worst characters, not just in the Final Fantasy VII mythos, but across the entire series itself. What's even more embarrassing is that Zack isn't really all that interesting either. The character never really feels like he's the one driving the story as much as he's just the sprite that you're controlling through this mess of a narrative that seems haphazardly slapped together. Even characters like Cloud and Tifa, who are thrown in for brief moments of cheap fan service, feel like a complete waste. In fact, the only character that's written to be more than a one-dimensional cardboard cutout is Sephiroth, who showcases a bit more personality than his portrayal from the original game. But the fact that the last few chapters simply retells Cloud's backstory in Nibelheim and replaces him with Zack, even this feels like a cheap attempt to reach fans of the original game, spoon-feeding them with moments they've already experienced from the original while everyone else stands by on the sidelines wondering just what the hell they're playing with zero context. It's like watching a bad fan fiction in slow motion that was uploaded to some random blog on the internet, except this story was conjured by the not-so-brilliant minds over at Square Enix during their slow, painful transition as one of the industry's worst companies. Regrettably, the bullshit doesn't stop with the story and continues into the combat system. This combat system from Crisis Core, both games, not just this remaster but the original as well, is one of the worst systems in the entire franchise. Crisis Core makes a very grave mistake with its combat system that's present in very few Final Fantasy games. But before I get to that point, let's talk about the DMW, which stands for Digital Mind Wave. The DMW is this stupid slot machine that sits its ass in the upper left-hand corner of the screen and acts as the central mechanic for the combat system in this game. How it works is that you need points called SP in order to conduct a spin. If you land 3 portraits of the same character, then the game will activate a unique ability, most of which are weak special attacks or some healing ability. If you land 3 of the same number, then the game will activate a buff of some sort. Or if you land 3 sevens, then you gain a level up. Sometimes the DMW will shift into a different phase, allowing you to call a summon, which those have different effects as well depending on the draw itself. The problem with this system is that it's completely random, meaning it's based on RNG. You don't directly control the DMW. The game does. As a result of this, the entire system surrounding the DMW is based on luck. Considering this mechanic is a core part of the combat system, it's not something that should be based on an attribute that the player literally has no control over. When you combine the fact that the core combat system itself outside the DMW is rather weak, only allowing the player a basic simple-minded 5-hit attack that's often interrupted by enemy action, with a ridiculously repetitive magic and ability system along with limited materia customization, and you're left with a game that, despite being updated, is still trapped back in 2007. A game that does everything it can to pry its original handheld identity away from the player, but fails to do so. And that grave mistake I mentioned previously is the lack of party members along with the lack of invincibility frames for when you're executing abilities, be it magic or AP attacks, which also was a problem with the Final Fantasy VII Remake. But at least there, you had the opportunity to switch party members. You have no such luxury in this game, and the presence of a party should be expected as a core mechanic in a Final Fantasy title. It should also be noted that I played and completed this game on hard mode, which is filled with some of the worst damage sponges I've ever seen in a video game, and one of the most overbloated content offerings I've played. This game has over 300 missions, each of whom are mindlessly repetitive with next to no story content to complement them. The game will simply drop you in a random area, put a marker on a map, and you must then run to the marker while encountering waves of enemies along the way, with random chests, most of which are filled with junk the majority of the time.
Yeah, that's what I was about.
What is this? I don't want this piece of junk.
When you arrive to the marker, you must fight and defeat a powerful enemy to end the mission. While this may seem like it's optional content, it's really not. In order to stand a chance in hell against some of the later bosses from the main story, you need to level up your stats and gain abilities strong enough to defeat them. The only way to do this is to play the missions and to level up substantially to clear the main story bosses without much trouble. You have to complete at least half of all the 300 missions that's available in the game, especially if you're going to be playing on hard mode. By the time I was finished with my playthrough, I had completed over 150 of these poorly designed missions, and I had lost my patience very early on. The missions are divided into difficulty categories, ranging from rank 1 through rank 10. The monsters that appear in the higher ranked missions are extremely durable and simply have an overabundance of health points. This behemoth, for example, has well over 100,000 health points, and the only way to take down monsters such as this is to slowly upgrade your Buster Sword's proficiency, which takes an eternity to do, and requires you to continue spamming the same stance attack over and over and over again, hundreds of times, if not more. Eventually, with enough proficiency, you'll unlock a limit break on attack damage, which will allow the player to land attacks that deal well over 10,000 damage points, 20,000, 30,000, 60,000, etc. This number can be doubled or tripled if you use the right ability paired with an attack up materia. The problem is, this is the only way to deal any kind of significant damage to enemies, rendering the core base attack useless. The monsters are so overpowered in this, on higher ranked missions, that I had to go in and lower the difficulty back to the only other possible setting, on normal, just to complete more missions in the game. The biggest slap in the face is that your mission progress doesn't carry over to a new game on New Game Plus. Instead, your mission progress resets at the end of the game, forcing you to restart them from the beginning, and some missions don't unlock until you reach certain points in the story. It's a completionist nightmare. Beyond the missions, or the rather short main story, the game contains no other content at all. No side missions, no mini-games, no combat challenges, no exploration incentives, nothing. It's an empty experience. Crisis Core Reunion is just another attempt from Square Enix to ride the nostalgia train through means of regurgitating the Final Fantasy VII IP. It's a remaster for a quick buck that updates a lot, but corrects none of the core issues from the original PSP release. It's not a game that's required to understand the lore of the original Final Fantasy VII, or thus far the remake trilogy. And it ultimately stands best as a title that can and should be skipped, as nothing of relevance is lost as a result of doing so.